Cool, thank you. So as you heard, I'm still writing my master's dissertation. So this paper is an attempt to pull together something that shows the direction of my research. So apologies for presenting something unfinished, but here we go. I've been struggling with two questions for some time now. The first question can be summarized as follows. Why is it that technologically advanced capitalist societies continue to engage in practices that we know are making life on this earth inhospitable? It's a question that I think everyone at this conference is asking. In fact, I've heard speakers here say it pretty much that way. Despite this, the question appears to be impossible to answer. The second question is deceptively simple. What is nature? And this question it's as old as thinking itself. Hegel once said that this question can always be asked, but never completely answered. So I've given myself two questions to answer, both of which appear to be impossible to answer. Despite this, my conviction is that the only way to answer these questions is to bring them together and answer them at the same time. We need to formulate these two questions as one problem. And the way I want to do this today is by going through my reading of Hegel's notion of natural beauty. Hegel praises natural beauty, but then eventually turns towards the aesthetic beauty of art. Many think that this makes Hegel anthropocentric, but I'm going to try and convince you otherwise today. From this reading, I will then use the concept of destruction developed by, or at least mentioned by Walter Benjamin, in order to argue for a better way of thinking about nature. I promised in my abstract that I'll be mediating these thoughts through cultural texts such as the TV show Planet Earth, but because of time restraints, I won't. So Hegel and natural beauty. The question, what is nature, can always be asked but never answered fully, as Hegel mentioned in The Philosophy of Nature. The question arises when we observe the world and want to grasp its eternal, simple essence. But such thinking that begins with the assumption that nature is a coherent, functioning, knowable totality, is where I think most popular notions of nature begin and end. Hegel defines two popular ways of relating to nature, which I still think are dominant today, despite there being others. I think these two are the dominant ones. The first is the practical relationship, and the other is via the study of physics. But when Hegel says physics, I take him to mean the physical sciences in general, and so from now on I'll be just saying science. The practical relationship between humans and nature is one in which nature is treated as merely a means to satisfy the needs of humans. For this relationship to function, the assumption that humans are separate from nature must be made, that nature is laid out before us in an externalized world and is there to be manipulated for our needs. The practical relationship is only concerned with particular objects of the external world. The universal aspect of nature is not considered, for example, when we convert trees into houses. In an encounter with nature, we use nature against itself. The relationship between humans and nature in this regard is thus a relationship between our appetites and the world brought into being through those appetites. Humans separate themselves from nature and then dominate nature. This idea, I think, is still popular today, the idea that nature is out there as something opposed to humans. Plenty of groups and sources and institutions explicitly define nature as that which is opposed to humans and human creations and human activity. But distant polar regions or, the deep Amazon rainforest or some faraway Pacific islands might qualify in this regard. But as everyone here knows, if we remind ourselves of the impact of global warming, pure untouched nature is just a complete fiction. There's not a corner of the planet that humans haven't altered or damaged indirectly or directly. And so if we insist on defining nature as something opposed to humans, then it doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't make much sense. The second relationship to nature, defined by Hegel, is the scientific. And this relationship seeks to know the universal aspect of nature. Science sets out to discover the universal laws that govern the movement and content of nature. It seeks to not just know whether trees can be used to build houses, but what natural laws determine the strength and malleability of trees. What science misses, however, is the way that thinking transforms objects. Even through a vast taxonomy of species, no two trees are identical. The same can be said for any object. We say atom, but there's no two identical atoms. We've got a general concept through which we denote a multitude of particulars. The features that render two similar but non-identical objects to be different are ignored in the final move towards the creation of a universal law. Science can't account for the role that thinking plays in the constitution of natural laws. Even if we revert to strict mathematical formula, the world isn't identical to the formula that tries to explain it. In fact, the only way that science recognizes human thinking is by creating rules and methods that can eliminate any irrational thinking that doesn't fit strict rational models. This remainder, this leftover irrational experiential side, is then explained through the mechanistic models of scientific explanation. I don't think science is wrong, it's just incomplete if we're going to turn to it to understand nature. I think there's more to be said than what science can provide. I think science is indispensable, just to qualify this point. But the link between the two relationships is that nature is posited as external to thinking, external to humans. And even the human body is kind of talked about as if it's external. You see this idea in a lot of recent political videos. The media company Vox makes a lot of videos. You may have heard of Vox, they're quite popular on YouTube. They made a video called Your Brain on Terrorism. And they make a lot of good points, but they present the problem in a way that makes humans sound like little entities sat inside an animal brain. They use phrases like, your brain cares much more about stories than statistics. And they say, all we can do is recognize that our brains aren't processing risk properly, and so on. And I can't stand this way of thinking about nature for a number of reasons, but not least of all because the split between human and nature, when examined in any depth, is kind of absurdly indefensible. If our brains aren't processing risk properly, then what part of our body are we using to counter this tendency? How do we think about a problem when the organ that we used to think is no longer trustworthy? If we take the idea that nature is opposed to humanity to its end, human beings appear as some phantom-like spirit that possesses the body of a weak, bald ape, commanding it to build civilizations. To put it another way, you eventually argue for a secular version of the soul. The role of philosophy should be to think of a way of relating to nature that accounts for thinking as a constitutional force. We should work through the notion of nature that places thinking back into nature without making it identical to it. And I think this is where Hegel's notion of natural beauty comes in. I don't have time to go into details, but Hegel argued that natural beauty is inferior to the aesthetic beauty of art. Many thinkers say that it makes him anthropocentric. They also say that he diagnosed a problem, namely the separation of humans from nature, and then went along with it anyway, and continued to put humans above nature. But I don't think this is the case. Hegel thought about the notion of beauty very closely with the notion of freedom. Freedom can, for the purposes of this talk, be defined as self-movement. Beginning with inanimate nature, such as rocks and dirt, Hegel moves towards more complex nature, such as animals. An animal is a unity of different parts held together, so organs, connective tissue, muscles, and it acts as an individual, despite being made of a multitude of different parts. Its organs don't move one way and its fur another, it stays as a unit. And the animal moves on its own. It operates as a unit, like I say. Whereas inanimate objects, inanimate nature can only move once compelled from the outside, like a rock smashing into another rock. But despite this self-contained activity, an animal remains bound to its species by law. It's bound to its species. The activity and freedom of an animal is inescapably bound to the drive of self-preservation. This looks a lot like the practical relationship to nature that we find between humans and nature. Nature's transformed when a bird makes a nest, or a funnel-web spider makes its trap, or an octopus uses coconut shells to hide from predators. When Hegel goes from inanimate nature to animate nature, he doesn't disregard each previous element as inferior or unworthy of attention. An animal, for example, is a multitude of less complex parts working together to sustain a complex being. The heart is nothing without the animal, and the animal is nothing without the heart. And Hegel maintains his appreciation of natural beauty, again, alongside his idea of freedom as self-movement, but he points out the lack of self-consciousness. Between the practical relationship and science, the products of humans that stand alien and hostile to nature are buildings, for example, and buildings are an attempt to use nature against itself for self-preservation. Fields, hedgerows, factories, moorlands, and plantations are all testament to humans manipulating nature for the purpose of self-preservation. As made clear, well, hopefully made clear earlier, animals can't go beyond the freedom delimited by the drive for self-preservation. And so we can say that the objects made by humans that stand opposed to nature remain within the bounds of self-preservation and therefore on the same level as the animal. So animals possess freedom, more freedom than rocks because they can move on their own. But their freedom is limited because of how closely tied they are to self-preservation. And humans have, for the most part, only acted on this same drive for self-preservation. And only in art do we see an activity that's not directed towards this animal-like and limited notion of freedom. I think Hegel's turn away from nature to art isn't a final turn, but one of historical necessity. Art was the only place that this kind of freedom existed in Hegel's day. It's the only place where you had this purposelessness beyond self-preservation, and it's there in art. But what can this do with our thinking on climate change? Well, firstly, we have to ask about this idea of self-preservation. Of course, as a species, we have to ensure our survival. This I'm not questioning. But to quote Adorno, technology has virtually made self-preservation easy. I'm going to get slightly vulgar here. There are 7 billion people on the planet, and we produce globally enough food to feed 11 billion. Despite this, 1 billion are starving to death. In 2013, David Attenborough said that the problem of famines and starvation was due to overpopulation, when he referred to humans as a plague on Earth. But this doesn't make sense when globally we produce enough food to feed every single person on the planet and then some. To quote Bill Hicks, see, everyone got boners over technology, and it was pretty incredible. Watching missiles fly down air vents was pretty unbelievable. But couldn't we feasibly use that same technology to shoot food at hungry people? End of quotes. And by the way, I think comedy is a great source of critical thinking. We don't have to be serious and morbid, as John Cleese once said. So I think, yeah, there's something there. But the problem of self-preservation for humans is no longer inescapable. I'm going to reveal more of my true colours now. Capitalism transforms even the most basic and essential of needs, such as food and shelter, into privately owned and produced commodities. I'm far from saying that prior to capitalism, everyone had access to food and shelter without any difficulty. But the problem we face today is in a capitalist society, so I want to talk about that. In a fully developed market economy, the things that we need to require to satisfy our basic human needs are privately owned and produced. To steal property, that is to steal food, to steal water and shelter, is to deny the owners of that property their basic rights. Marx encountered this with the collection of firewood. The collection of firewood is an activity that does no more than try and prevent oneself from freezing to death, but it's punishable as theft. And still today, if a person resorts to stealing food to stave off malnourishment, they can find themselves imprisoned. A guy called Darren Head hadn't eaten for 2 days. This story was on The Guardian. On the way to claim his benefits, he realised he looked quite emaciated. And this might lead one of the benefits officers to think he was either using drugs, or he was drunk, or he wasn't looking after himself, especially if he couldn't think straight through because of the hunger. So on the way, he decided to steal a sandwich. He got caught and was fined £80, and because he couldn't pay it, he went to prison. So these examples, I think, are endless. Food banks, homelessness, etc., etc. So despite the enormous amount of wealth and availability of food and shelter, a life devoted to achieving bare survival and self-preservation is forced upon people as a basic principle of daily life. And I think here is the crux of the problem of climate change. The manipulation of nature to become something which satisfies human needs is eventually killing the planet. But we can't do anything else because we're forced to act according to the principle of self-preservation. And because it's so pervasive, the principle of self-preservation appears to be the dominant motive of all human activity. We hear it all the time, humans are just selfish. But appearances aren't necessarily false. Like I said, the vast majority of the population are forced to obey the principle of self-preservation. I do it all the time, just like everyone else in the room. Sure, I'd love to live according to my principles and adhere to these moral codes that I've thought my way towards, but I've got rent to pay, so I'm going to have to get a job selling shit to people who don't need it. What am I going to do? But what's missed in the appearance that self-preservation is the dominant driving force of human activity is that the current situation is entirely synthetic. Food and shelter aren't sparse, they're withheld. This makes it very difficult to know what our primary and secondary needs are. It makes it difficult to commit to any radical change because the way things are set up appear as though they're essential to our self-preservation as a species. Take current conservation projects. I get a lot of this from George Monbiot and the Rewilding Project. The National Park Association in the UK. It tries to maintain the culture of sheep farming and grouse hunting while also maintaining awareness that nature can't support these activities. But their attempt at a solution is to bring the two together without changing either at all. But the moorlands are a product of human activity. The moorlands have been stripped bare of the forest that would grow there if they were left alone. And around 9,000 years ago, the UK was covered in thick, dense and diverse forest that didn't need any human intervention to maintain itself. But through human activity, it was felled and stripped back. The Yorkshire Dales, the moors above Hebden Bridge, someone mentioned earlier, would be a rainforest were it not for the interference of the National Park Association. Of course, they didn't cut down the forest, but they do ensure it doesn't return. By stripping and burning the moors, they present themselves as conserving nature, when really they're burning and stripping away nature. What this kind of conservation does is treat nature as it appears now, as a static, unchanging entity. Human activity tore away the forests, and now it ensures that the wound never heals. But this open wound bleeds, like I say. The floods in Leeds, in Hebden Bridge, were caused by the lack of upland trees absorbing and diverting the huge amount of rainflow coming off the Yorkshire Dales. The way that nature is understood now ensures catastrophe after catastrophe. And the floods, it should be noted, aren't just catastrophic for people. The loss of soil fertility, habitats and food is catastrophic for countless other living species on this planet, around this area. To consider it a problem only for humans is to, again, like George Carlin said, the planet's fine, we're fucked. It's considered out there as a unified whole doing fine, and everything's a problem for us. So what does this have to do with Hegel trying to tie all this together? So I want to bring back this idea of freedom beyond self-preservation. Now, climate change is happening, and it's been happening for a long time. Like I said earlier in the talk, the idea that nature still exists untouched out there is a romantic fiction. The way to combat climate change isn't to have this dangerous blend of our current way of life with our current ideas of nature. It's also not possible to go for a hands-off approach. It's demonstrably impossible to have a hands-off approach from nature. And so I want to use the notion of destruction found in Walter Benjamin's essay, The Destructive Character, to become quite vulgar. I want to argue for the destruction of nature. The ideas of nature that are popular now are clearly destructive in the negative sense, flooding and global warming, etc. And so I want to go back to Benjamin and reverse this notion of destruction and show how theoretically and practically we have to destroy nature if we're going to ensure its survival. Destruction isn't just destruction for destruction's sake. It's not just this nihilistic approach. Destruction is more like clearing a space or making room. Destruction takes an idea that seems obvious or common sense and splits it open. It opens a space for thinking to breathe a little bit. If an idea is like a derelict building, destruction just like shakes it to the ground, but then doesn't insist upon what will be built. If an idea is like a barren moorland, for example, destruction tears down the fence posts and encourages wildlife to arise that have been officially declared extinct. It's impossible to provide solid examples of this, although there are projects that point towards this kind of environmentalism. Like I mentioned, rewilding is one such example. Rewilding isn't a hands-off approach where we take a step back and become a passive observer. It's also not the strict management of what nature's forced to be. Rewilding re-establishes the foundations of the lost habitats prior to management and agriculture, and then once the foundations are laid, nature is then left to develop on its own terms. Rewilding doesn't reverse damage, but re-establishes habitats that were lost, and then now cause catastrophes. Now, of course, this requires the intervention of humans, and I think this is a good thing. I think it requires the knowledge produced by science about what the correct species to plant and what the climate can host and what will be damaging in that area. But I think these traces of human intervention are what Hegel refers to when he claims that self-consciousness should be released back into nature as nature. And in Hegelian terms, the subject doesn't manipulate nature strictly for self-sufficiency, but releases part of self-consciousness from itself to ensure the existence of nature. The subject doesn't have to know what nature will look like fully after rewilding, and it also doesn't have to know the use value of this nature. All it has to do is release part of itself back into nature to remain faithful to it. Through the activity of letting go, through the kind of active passivity, the subject grants freedom to nature beyond mere self-preservation. But rewilding, I argue, would be a total failure if it was taken as a standalone eco-project. Rewilding has to be radically political, and I think bear in mind these notions of self-movement and freedom found in Hegel. So rather than look at how people are now, how they behave when forced to act upon the principle of self-preservation, we should destroy this image in the Benjaminian sense and speculate what life could be like, what we could be like, what humans could become if food, shelter and water was guaranteed rather than withheld. We need to clear a space. That is, we need to actively ensure that the space currently occupied by activities that focus on self-preservation is destroyed. In the same way that a forest is denied the chance to grow on the moors through regimented burning, we have to start dreaming about what could become of us if we weren't so burned by the structures that deprive us of our basic needs. Thank you.